So here's some feedback on your questions from discussion board 4. First question is from Casey. What is your opinion on the functional syllabus, and would you choose to use it in your classroom? Are there any disadvantages of using the functional syllabus method? Well, one of the problems with a functional approach is that it's not easy to be able to teach the grammar that goes with the functional syllabus. What you'll probably find is you need a parallel grammar syllabus. And when we talk about syllabuses, really what we're talking about is multiple syllabuses that are happening at the same time. So, for example, most course books, successful course books these days, will list a series of different syllabi in the beginning of the course book. So you'll have a grammar syllabus, you'll have a lexical syllabus, you'll have a functional syllabus, and you'll have a skills syllabus. So what we're trying to do there is trying to encompass all the different types of syllabi that possibly you can begin to organize your classes around. Now, going back to the notion of the functional syllabus, it really often depends on the kinds of classes you're teaching. So a functional syllabus can work extremely well in a situation where students are learning English to master a particular job or in a situation where it's English for specific purposes. So for example, say you were teaching students who were trained to be tour guides or operating in tourism, then you could begin to look at the different functions that the tour guide operator has to do, and that could be the organization of your syllabus. And that could be a very, very effective approach in that particular context. James says, a common theme among several of the prominent teaching methods is the exploitation of vocabulary or language skills during a lesson. The use of the same language in different situations, i.e. repetition, is helpful for students trying to solidify newly acquired knowledge. How do we as instructors prevent the exploitation of materials from being boring and predictable? I can see the value in repetition, but students may quickly become disinterested if the lesson's subject matter is not diverse enough. Um, yeah, repetition is an essential part of language learning. If you think of learning your first language, then there's an awful lot of repetition that happens when kids are young. Nursery rhymes, stories read over and over again, songs which repeat the same language, and kind of routines, bedtime, bath time, dinner time, which repeat the same language. So the challenge for language teachers is thinking of creative ways of repeating particular material. So that's one thing. For example, if you're doing a particular drill, which can be highly repetitive and rote, you can begin to think of ways that you can make it more interesting. For example, you can use what's called a mood card. So instead of saying the dialogue, practicing the dialogue in a kind of a normal, conventional way, then maybe you're sleepy, maybe you're angry, maybe you're frightened. And can you deliver the same particular dialogue using those particular moods? Um, and we can also vary the particular repetition of a role, for example, a drill, by giving certain roles that students can play, which varies the way that they deliver the particular material. Repetition is one thing, right? Recycling is another. And the way that we need to operate is that we're going to recycle the particular content, the lexis and the grammar, in different ways. And that's why we talk about moving from one skill to another skill when we go from an in-task to a post-task. One last little piece of information about particular games, going back to the notion of first language acquisition and the nature of games which have a lot of repetition in them. There's a little game called Mrs. Jones went to the supermarket and bought an apple. Next person says, Mrs. Jones went to the supermarket and bought an apple and a banana. Next person says, Mrs. Jones went to the supermarket and bought an apple, a banana, and some carrots. Okay, so you continue through the alphabet. Now that's highly repetitive, but it's a lot of fun because students have to remember all those different words. Bailey says, there being with this being so many different language learning teaching techniques and theories out there, I can't help wondering, are any of these techniques better suited to teaching speakers of certain languages like Mandarin Chinese or Arabic than speakers of other languages like Japanese or Spanish or Russian? So when we're considering the particular kinds of approaches, techniques, methods we're going to use with specific, say, language or cultural groups, we take in consideration many things. For example, we could talk about age, for example. We could talk about, in terms of needs analysis, what do these students need to do? Do they need to learn to speak? Do they need to learn to read, for example? And what is the particular content that they need to master? So all those are particular important questions when you're deciding on a particular approach, a method. All the languages you mentioned there, of course, you don't use the Roman script. So one of the problems you do have there, of course, is that you're going to have to teach writing, a new particular writing system. And so that is one more way of impacting your choice of a particular method. So for example, it could be that you do a lot of ALM, which is very acoustically based. You're asking students to remember sounds and to use those sounds in particular situations, in particular dialogues and dialogue builds. So those kinds of considerations help you begin to choose a particular method. The other kinds of considerations are the particular cultures that those students from those particular countries are used to in terms of the classroom. So you have to begin to think, well, what are the expectations? What are their expectations about what is supposed to happen in a classroom? And one of the problems with the cumulative language teaching approach, CLT, is that it often can conflict with the expectations and norms that are current in particular types of classrooms in some of those countries. Catherine says, often language teachers are evaluated by their schools based on test scores rather than actual language acquisition. In some cases, they only have their students for a school year. What methods are best for teachers to use to both help students acquire the language and get good test scores? There's no quick way to teach a language necessarily, but how can a teacher best help students they only have for a few months to get a good start on the target language? Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's a classic dilemma, and it's very hard to know how to deal with a kind of a situation like this. We all know about teaching to the test and how that affects the classroom. So if your students are taking the TOEFL and that's the major measure of their success of their language classes, then it would be a terrible mistake to devote all the time to TOEFL teaching, because that would be utterly boring. And remember, the TOEFL test is a test of problem solving. It really isn't that much of a test of language proficiency. That being said, because those are the ways of, then you have, of course, to help students pass those particular tests. So the answer is the usual, the usual in terms of trying to balance the needs of being successful on the test and also creating meaningful language learning situations. Learning to do well on the TOEFL test is not a meaningful language teaching or learning situation. So yeah, how can you balance the two? And I think that's what you do. You have to balance the two. Anthony says, what techniques have you incorporated or think you would be practical if you haven't taught yet when trying to assess whether the objectives in your lesson plan have been accomplished? Excusing the use of a quiz or test for the moment, how else can you determine whether the class is comfortable to proceed in the lesson or to the next topic or grammar point? Um, okay, well, there's a certain assumption there that students have to master one thing before they can progress to the next thing, and I would contest that. I think what we have to think is in terms of learning as being cyclical, that we keep coming back to the particular lessons and points that we've taught several weeks before. And in that cyclical approach is one way of testing whether students have actually got something, right? So if we do a series of lessons, then what we're hoping to do is revisit those lessons at a later stage, and then you can better assess whether those goals, those objectives have been met or not. So circling back is a way of testing just how much students have got and what they still need to have. But please don't think of they have to master this before we go on to this, because I think that is not the most productive approach. Sarah says, I do not have much experience with ALM. Does anyone else have experience with it? How effective did you find it? Do you think it's difficult to teach and or learn successfully with this method? Well, I hope you've had a look at the example of an ALM lesson that is there for you to look at, and I particularly brought attention to one particular part of that lesson where a student is having great difficulties repeating, they're being called upon. ALM, of course, is very focused on speaking, so it is an approach which fulfills particular objectives in terms of speaking. It's very teacher-centered. You can begin to choose particular dialogues which are perhaps appropriate to the students' needs in terms of the jobs they're going into. As I've been trying to argue in throughout the discussion of all these different methods, is that one of the most important thing is finding out what kind of teacher you are and what kind of approach you like to take. Um, so I'm encouraging you to try these out just to find out whether they fit for you. And if they fit for you, they can be successful. Okay, so thank you for those questions, and I'll have more responses to discussion board 5.